Hi everyone who's already on this call. Thanks for joining. We'll just start, I think, up in maybe a couple of minutes. Give some time for other people to join. Right? Thanks. Right. Hello. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining. We had a few more people, actually, many more people who we thought would join, but we can get it started, and then hopefully they'll join over the course of the event. So thanks to everyone for joining. Before we start, and we'll do this at the end again, I think need to thank Pranav, who's of course on the call, who worked with me over the past couple of weeks to put this event together, and Akash, who is part of our design and communications team, who worked with us to put together the agenda and create the design and everything. So thanks to both of them. My name is Arindrajit. I work as a research manager at the Center for Internet and Society. Sorry, I just realized my video was off. I work as a research manager at the Center for Internet and Society. I co-edited this issue of Seminar magazine, which is one of India's oldest such magazines on India and digital world making, with Karthik Nachiappan, who is a research fellow at the National University of Singapore. And we are really excited to have all the authors who penned essays for this issue on the call, discussing both the essays themselves and allied work with us here today. Before we start, we'll start with the first panel, which Astha is kindly agreed to chair. A quick few words about the issue itself. So first of all, Ambar was supposed to give a few introductory remarks, but I think he's been having some technical issues. Hopefully he'll be able to join back in later in the call. But just a few introductory remarks on the issue itself. And let me start off slightly in a more abstract fashion, where I've heard the comment very often, particularly from the technology community in Bangalore, that India doesn't really have larger strategic thinking on technology or tech policy when it comes to the geopolitical dimensions. And this has been applied both to the government thinking and to civil society and academia that are trying to intervene in this space. And while partially this statement may be true when it comes to the government, and some of the essays actually explore this issue, with regard to civil society and academia, there actually has been a fair bit of thinking on this issue over the past couple of years. The only possible issue is that the foreign policy community and the technology policy community perhaps haven't been speaking to each other as much as we could be. And this issue is one small step towards trying to get two excellent communities in India talking and collaborating more for the future. So it's really more of a starting point, and hopefully that will lead to more robust discourse, including at the policy level in the near future. The second point I wanted to make was that when Karthik and I first conceptualized this issue way back in January, and then actually sent requests to authors to write, there have been a number of changes, and there has been some of them fairly dramatic. So the first change, of course, is with regard to China, and just the way in which India's non-tech relationship with China has changed, has potentially changed some of the issues that are or questions that are discussed in this issue. For example, as of January, we were fairly sure that Chinese vendors might be allowed to participate in Indian 5G trials. That has, of course, changed with a number of the developments along the border, with now it being fairly certain that Huawei and ZTE will not be allowed into 5G trials, but Manoj will speak more about that, of course. There has been a sort of convergence between US big tech and Indian big tech, even though before they were on polar opposite ends of issues such as data localization. So the Reliance Facebook deal is an example, and there are a number of other investments coming in from US. Often one could argue that it's taking space that is being restricted when it came to Chinese tech. So Chinese tech had a fairly sizable had made fairly sizable inroads into the Indian tech space, but that's potentially changing with the geopolitical shifts. And of course, finally, something that we'll discuss across both panels is that there have been a number of domestic policies that have come up since this issue was written, and definitely since we had conceptualized this. The two most notable ones are, of course, the National Open Digital Ecosystem policy that was put out a couple of months back, and then more recently, of course, the one that's still under consultation, the regulatory framework for non-personal data. And all of these domestic policy issues actually speak to how India engages at the world stage. And these changes will continue to happen, and therefore this issue cannot be a permanent set of essays that will never be updated, right? The ideas might be useful, but really we need to think of change as not being an aberration, but being something that this space will continue
Just give us a minute. We will see what's wrong and fix this.
Hi, sorry, am I audible? I think I dropped off. Yes, sorry, yeah. Um, yeah, Pranav, could you remind me where I dropped off? Um, Okay, I'll just start where I thought I last spoke. Is that we need to account for changes is the last point that I made when we shape strategy. And the final point about the issue, the 2 points that I wanted to make were that there are 8 essays in a series of 3 excellent book reviews of excellent books. And the 8 essays are I suppose segregated along the lines of this event today, where we have a panel on security issues and another panel on data governance. But as we'll see, it's theoretically easy to make this segregation, but actually these issues are fairly linked. And I hope that the conversation today underscores that point to some extent. The final point is that when we wrote to authors who you will hear from today, we asked them to comment on three aspects of this issue. So one is, what is the global landscape in this space? What are the global developments? What is the global narrative with each essay and therefore each topic area? Second is, what are India's domestic interests and domestic policy ambitions in this space? And that's the second question that was covered in all essays very well. And then the final question is bringing 1 and 2 together. How India's domestic policy landscape and domestic policy ambitions actually shape the global narrative and can be used to further shape the global narrative. So those are just very quick thoughts I had about the issue. And Karthik, of course, who will be speaking both on this panel and at the end of this event, I'm sure will have more thoughts uh, on the framing of this issue itself. But before that, it's my pleasure to introduce Astha, who is Astha Kapoor, who is the co-founder of Apti Institute. And when I was thinking of who can chair the panel on data governance, it was a no-brainer that that I would reach out to her, because she's done some excellent work on data governance and specifically with data stewardship in terms of how the Indian state treats its data vis-a-vis Indian citizens. And really interesting to see how she leads this session in terms of how the Indian state treats data vis-a-vis other states and vis-a-vis the citizens of other states. And really excited to have her chair this panel. Hopefully I will have no further technical snags. Over to you, Astha, and thanks again for joining us.
Thank you so much, Arindrajit, and thank you so much for everybody for joining us. And this is such an interesting conversation because, like Arindrajit, you said, these are not two disciplines that speak with each other, and they should. And I'm really glad that this seminar issue is a starting point for that conversation, because we've been examining India's role in thinking about unlocking the value of data, and obviously the non-personal data committee report comes at an interesting time. But also over the last few years, I'm not sure what conversations you were having in Bangalore, Arindrajit, because the ones that I've heard is very much structured to India's soft power with regard to its, technological prowess and what we've been able to achieve, whether it's with, the sort of digital public infrastructures, as they're called now, of Aadhaar and UPI, and how do we think about, exporting the stack in some ways. But it's also interesting because there's obviously a certain exceptionalism with regard to India and what we've been able to build over the last 10 years, and questions about how our experience is applicable to other parts of the world, especially since we are a country that's existing without a data protection framework and building technology at nauseating speeds. So I think with that in mind, India, both, when data governance frameworks are examined, India becomes one of those examples that people do study. It's almost like there's the US, there's China, there's EU, and then there's India. And in particular, with regard to sort of a leadership in the global South, India's role is becoming quite interesting. And also, I think we as a country are growing to that imagination of being a leader with regard to questions of data and governance around that. So, I mean, I'm very excited to speak to the panelists, and there've been some excellent essays in the seminar, and I'd like to kick it off with you, Karthik, and because the work that you and Arindrajit did together sort of like lays out the landscape, and would be wonderful to understand how you imagine India's role in this sort of context of international governance, especially from the perspective of the fact that we are in a certain way an exceptional case.
Right. So can you hear me? Great. So let me first thank CIS and Arnajit for organizing this panel and for bringing all of us here together after many months of working on this and revising it and having it out, and now presenting it and getting more feedback from the tech community and the foreign policy community. As Arnajit mentioned, this is too important an issue to be sequestered within one community, and we hope that by writing these sets of essays, that more people across different fields and areas and policy networks and communities will be able not just to speak with each other, but also think about the implications of how these issues connect. So in terms of data, and the piece that Arnajit and I wrote, focused on data governance and how and the role India is playing within data governance, and how the overall data governance architecture worldwide is affecting India's own approach and policies. So what I'll do is I'll sort of answer the question with respect to India's positions on data governance by looking at how the existing multilateral frameworks are discussing rules and standards on data. So what we have now is a global landscape where institutions, organizations, and frameworks are increasingly unable and unwilling to deal with really critical issues like data, because the broader politics and geopolitics around technologies and economic issues have become very fraught. So the World Trade Organization, which should ideally negotiate standards and rules, is struggling because it cannot bring countries together. And moreover, it's bogged down by what principles it should use to negotiate rules around data, and how it should even classify data, whether as a good or as a service. Plurilateral frameworks, so trade agreements, like TTIP, TPP, the CPTPP, and RCEP have made some headway here because there's some appetite to discuss these issues amongst countries that have very similar economies. The G20, for example, under Japan's leadership in 2019, entered this whole global discussions on data to generate some consensus amongst countries that have seemingly different positions and stakes on how they should manage data and draft policies under their own remit, so that it does not hinder trade and investment between each other. But I think divisions even there within the G20 have marred its ability to drive rulemaking or even generate some kind of a consensus. The EU particularly feared whether the US and Japan will sacrifice privacy considerations at the altar of digital innovation. And we see that play out recently with the Schrems II decision between the European Union and the United States. So there are clear divisions even between transatlantic partners on these issues. And then China, Russia, and India have, of course, demurred for various reasons. So this fragmented global data landscape means that India will increasingly find it harder to shape data rules given where its own interests lie. I think India's positions on data globally naturally have been an extension of what's been happening domestically and their domestic policy priorities and ambitions, embracing data sovereignty, countering data colonialism, and retaining publicly generated data to aid state power, particularly when it comes to public service delivery and welfare provision. So India will likely push going ahead for global data rules that advance and somewhat shields the role of the state. Former Foreign Secretary Vijay Gokhale, before he left office, reiterated that global governance discussions on data must not take place within plurilateral forums outside the World Trade Organizations. And doing so would reduce the say of emerging and developing economies in those debates. Well, that's where we are, and that's what's happening, because key markets like the EU and the United States prefer different frameworks and approaches to not just regulate data domestically, but export those rules and standards globally. So ultimately, what does that come down to? Global engagement on questions related to data will be difficult in India in the absence of settled domestic policy. I think the slew of incoherent and inconsistent domestic policies diminishes the values of India's data sovereignty message abroad. And now that's one way of that's one way that you can capture India's so-called exceptionalism, this message on data sovereignty. But it's increasingly finding fewer takers, particularly in the bigger markets abroad. So a better coordinated approach that resolves the conflicts and the uncertainties domestically, I think, will help India far more in shaping global data rules that then protect its own economic interests thereafter. I'll stop there.
Yeah.
Perfect. That's fascinating, and also like nicely slips into, Divij's essay in a certain way, which looks at India's data sovereignty policy and the ways in which it could be potentially problematic. And Divij, I would love a comment in terms of how you think the data sovereignty policies of India currently fit into the broader global narrative, but also why they are in a certain way problematic.
Thanks, Asta, and thanks, Karthik. That was really helpful. Also, as a good segue into what I would like to speak about, and so I just wanted to go in a little bit as to why I chose this framing, right? Both because of like its increasing use as a metaphor for how how politics over data and the digital world should happen, and also what it reflects about the political ambitions of the Indian state, right? So in my essay, what I intended to do was to draw a kind of historical context for what's now happening, or these emerging trends around, as Karthik mentioned, India's claims and assertions towards sovereignty over data or the digital, right? And I think it's really important to note the kind of political economy in which this has arisen, right? So you've seen an Indian, recently, like nascently liberalized and globalized Indian economy, moving towards standardization of trade norms, which led to, say, the first kind of uh, legal regulations around the internet, which was through the IT Act, which explicitly spoke to UNCITRAL model rules around global e-commerce and trade, right? And this goes back, of course, to broader like context around how how trade rules have emerged and how the internet has always been has always been embedded in the context of increasing globalization and trade and liberalization of trade measures, right? And linked to that, of course, you've seen developments in the WTO, which of course Karthik and Arindrajit also mentioned, such as the moratorium on e-commerce transactions, which was of course largely led by global North states, accepted of course by Indian, by developing countries which didn't have so much of a say in kind of e-commerce transactions or the internet ecosystem back in the late 90s and the early 2000s. Linked to that, there are of course other geopolitical concerns which um, again like are important to keep in mind. So in particular, I would point to, for example, the OECD rules on taxation, right? A framework which they've tried to develop for almost a decade now, but to which they've not come to a particular consensus on, and which developing countries have kind of not really been in the loop with. And there's a fascinating article by Shreya Rao, which kind of really, gives the historical context to more recent policy developments in India, such as the equalization levy, which is also an attempt to kind of claw back sovereignty from the geopolitical domain of, multinational corporations and tax evasion, right? So, what is the fair trade of tax that our country should get in this particular context? And the second like dominant trend, I think, which India is trying to respond to now is the rise of not just kind of if geopolitics speaks to state sovereignty, then there's a different kind of sovereignty that's emerged, which I think Frank Pascal calls functional sovereignty, which is the sovereignty asserted by these large multinational firms and these large platforms such as Amazon, Google, or Facebook, which are very much involved in creating their own rules separately and not controlled by states, right? And these platforms are also buoyed by this network of transnational actors and standard setting organizations like the IETF or the IEEE. And Julie Cohen calls these networked network legal institutional structures um, which go to the very root of kind of how the internet is built and shaped, right? So the kind of rules and standards, particularly the technical standards, which also incorporate a lot of the norms that a lot of the norms and politics that Karthik was referring to, have also not been shaped directly by states, of course influenced by states, but I would say more influenced by this emergence of platforms and the emergence of this new form of information economy, right? And I would say that, in terms of norm setting, India was kind of not really on top of either of these developments, right? There's historically been a lack of engagement, I believe, with what India really wants from these kind of norm setting institutions, both either at the WTO level or at the IETF, IEEE level, and standard setting organizations, in the way that it has done so in other situations, like when it was negotiating in the Doha development rounds, or over TRIPS negotiations for producing generic medicines. And we've seen that those kinds of negotiations, when we've had a clear path for what technological sovereignty means for us, it's been massively beneficial, right? The identification of a public interest in producing generic medicines has made India the #1 generic medicine producer in the world, and it's benefited our own population, it's benefited developing countries around the world. But we don't see this particular, we don't see this identification of a particular public interest in either our international stances or our domestic policies. And to come to that, second part, so in, earlier, I would say, even up to the last decade, there was a fairly explicit kind of, an acquiescence, at least in India, that, we're okay with promoting forms of multi-stakeholderism and internationalism in internet governance. And you can see this on the stances that India took during the ICANN transition debates, where it explicitly endorsed multi-stakeholderism in one of the most important, core infrastructures of the internet, which is the DNS system. Now, cut to a few years ago, when you see this new trend emerging of data localization, and I think I'll actually speak to a few of the kind of dominant trends by citing specific examples of how the country has, how state policy has tried to assert this form of political state sovereignty over the internet and over data. And so the first one, for example, could be Press Note 3 from 2 years ago, which explicitly regulated FDI-linked e-commerce, right? So rules of platform neutrality, which spoke explicitly to a form of trade protectionism within India, which didn't really have to do too much with FDI, but were driven by kind of internal, like domestically influenced policies about trade. A second is, of course, this major kind of trend of data localization that's emerged and has been cross-cutting across policy, from the e-commerce policy to the PDP bill, and which also reflects kind of, this somewhat hasty technique to assert territorial sovereignty, because that's something that is still gone unchallenged in the international domain, is that, territorial sovereignty is de facto sovereignty over a particular resource or a particular, over any particular domain. And asserting that territorial sovereignty has been important, both, I would say, for asserting, say, taxation norms which require a nexus to a particular territory. It's important for kind of, asserting this increasing, the situation where India wants to control data as a resource, as if, something that exists in servers and can be mined. Although I think that that's a fairly blunt and kind of, a very vague form of asserting it, but it seems to be the kind of origins of first reclaiming the data, and then maybe we can do something about that later. And this, of course, also links back to forums like the non-personal data framework, which tend to reconceptualize information or data as a national resource. Now, the problem, of course, is that, and the primary problem, while all of this, it's important to recognize the kind of inequity in the historical trends and the kind of political economy that's produced the kind of internet we have today, India still doesn't seem to have a vision of what a good internet looks like, and it also doesn't seem to speak to the interests of, say, not just the early internet, but even our contemporary internet, where we've kind of built networks, built solidarity across commerce, across communities, even while we continue to exist on maybe unfair and inequitable platforms, right? So it doesn't mean that the state suddenly stepping in will subsume all of these interests or deflect these interests, and it doesn't seem to be there doesn't seem to be any kind of discussion about what kind of limitations exist on the state's assertions of sovereignty here, right? And we've seen where assertions of sovereignty over resources have previously been problematic in particularly within the context of this development discourse, and we've seen how kind of like you know treating oil or coal as a national resource within the framework of this, World Bank, IMF linked development discourse has led to displacement and has led to violence. And I'm kind of worried basically that, by replicating the same kind of framework, by replicating the same kind of discussions, we're again going to lead, we're not going to talk about agency and self-determination, but we're simply talking about what's best in the conception of the state, which has seemingly limitless powers of control over the internet. So yeah, my final point that this seems to be a somewhat dangerous precedent to go down this path without having a clear and, I would say, a constitutionally embedded perception of what the common public good is and why we are trying to regulate data in a particular way.
No, that's super useful, and I particularly sort of like the idea of, you know, a certain violence that comes with frameworks of sovereignty in the context of data. But Vidushi, just coming to the piece that you wrote on AI, which is another, space that India clearly wants to be a world leader in, and we're signing on to multiple forums. We have AI policies coming out every year, it would appear. So also just to understand, and also referring to the piece that you wrote, like can we, given the context that Karthik and Divich have already mentioned, like, are we in a position to be a global leader when it comes to AI?
Thanks. I think that's like a loaded question, and I'm sure it's intentionally so. I'm going to take a bit of liberty here and just like narrating how I thought about the essay, because I think a lot of the questions that you're asking, I was asking myself when I was like, okay, I have 3,000 words and I need to answer this huge question. When we talk about governance, when we talk about artificial intelligence, there's an assumption to be, when we think about governance, there's an assumption to think about, the UN, the OECD, a lot of, intergovernmental settings, even the global partnership on AI that's just, been announced recently that India is part of it. We tend to think of those kinds of forums. And I think the first reorientation that I'd like to offer is that when we think about being a leader in the realm of AI and the realm of governance, we need to engage with how textured the field really is. So for instance, India is now, I think, setting up a center of excellence for the ITU in the next year. So there's clearly, this move towards standardization in intergovernmental organizations. It's part of the global partnership on AI. We're not really sure what it's going to do. It seems to be headed towards, governance frameworks, quote unquote governance frameworks that, are concerned with human rights and dignity and all of these really broad words. But then when I think about AI governance, and this is obviously because I spend time in spaces that are purely technical, I'm also thinking of, where is India's leadership, or where's India's thought leadership when it comes to technical design of these systems, or technical standardization of these systems. And so when I think about India being a leader in the field, I almost think that you have to understand shared language. You have to be in different places at the same time. You have to talk to different stakeholders, different communities. And I don't think that is happening. So, at the global level, I think the first thing is that we're not at the places where these systems are being designed. We're at the places where politicians and, civil servants talk about how to control these systems and how to harness these systems for development and business, and it's going to cure cancer and poverty and loneliness and whatnot. But we're not really engaging with what these systems actually are. And that leads me to the second point, which is there seems to be this constant disconnect between what technologies can do and what policy initiatives think they can do. So there's like this huge, like, Grand Canyon style of disconnect between what is anonymized data, right? Like in the context of machine learning, we know that anonymized data is kind of like a misnomer, but we have policy initiatives in India that are based on the assumption that data once anonymized can become a good that can be monetized and things like that. So I think there's like a huge gap that needs to be filled in current approaches, where we're constantly looking at, it's almost like AI is this really fashionable game that everyone wants to play, like all stakeholders, all countries want to play. You have ethical frameworks that are cropping up, like you said, there's a dime a dozen. I don't think that more ethical frameworks are the thing that's going to help us govern AI better. In fact, it's just confusing. You don't need more, understandings of transparency at this point. I think what we need is a clearer understanding of what these systems shouldn't do, can't do, how they're going to incrementally help, why we need them, and then how you think about governance. So I think there's like, we've almost like turned it on its head, where we're first thinking of like, this is going to save X, this is going to save us in some realm of health, but we're not asking like, what are the pitfalls? What are the ways in which we can think about regulating it given current laws and things like that. So I think that, this is a really long-winded way of answering your question, which is, how can India be a leader in the space? I think the first thing that we need to do is not try and transport, conversations from the EU or the US or even China and try and adapt them to the Indian context. I think it has to necessarily be ground up. I think the CEO of Baidu sometime last year said, the US and China will compete on the economic potential of AI, and Europe and the UK can think about the ethics. And I think that in and of itself is so telling of how reductive the field has become. And I think resisting that sort of reductive framing of, having one page on ethics in a 100-page document that talks about India's roadmap on AI, it just feels almost disingenuous. Not having civil society in the door when you're thinking about writing these systems, but asking for comments after it's been written, not really accounting for how you take in those comments. Those kinds of things I think need to change, because at some point it's like putting a band-aid on a gunshot wound, right? Like, you're not going to really fix messy problems unless you're willing to get messy when you're articulating them or you're thinking of ways in which to deal with them. So I'll stop there, but I'm happy to take any questions going forward.
That's fascinating. And it's interesting because a lot of everything that you, Karthik, Divij have said so far has pointed to a certain disconnect in the way that India is positioning itself, and then the reality of it, on the ground domestically, and how domestic policy in a certain way is disconnected from how we imagine sort of our global policy to be. And that's interesting because this would be also, for Torsha's paper on content regulation. I think one of the things that comes out very clearly in the paper is that, India is not, because of a certain kind of exceptionalism, and I guess that's, we cannot apply global governance mechanisms to the way that we think about content regulation. There are severe limitations, but also then what are in some ways the alternatives, given the realities that we are living in a space where policy and tech are possibly disconnected. We do not have robust systems where civil society can be engaged, processes can be consultative. So Tosha, would love your thoughts on, like, what do you think are the limitations of a certain global governance mechanism on content regulation?
Right. Thanks, Asta. I think before I get into your question, I'd like to give a short shout out to Karthik and Arinjit, who are co-authors on the article and who really brought in some really interesting perspectives into whatever we argue. The thing with content regulation, it essentially boils down to a question of speech. And speech, as I see it, speech is always rooted in the contextual and regional and societal uh, factors of the speaker. And when I'm trying to regulate it and when I'm trying to moderate it, that's also rooted, me as a moderator, my decision is also rooted in my contextual and my regional, my societal backing. So having a global sort of framework or having an international framework assumes that speech is agnostic to context, that speech can be moderated in a linear, objective way. And I think that's where the and I'll try to like kind of bolster this with a practical example, and that is of when you look at major social media platforms, a lot of them are rooted in America, which has an expansive freedom of expression right by way of the First Amendment. The First Amendment and their priorities, despite being a private entity, their priorities more often than not reflect Western priorities, or even if it's not a Western-based social media platform, they will always reflect priorities of the region they're coming from. And this can go many ways. One of the ways can be, if you take the example of when YouTube was called into question to sort of censor a video that was clearly defaming the Thai royalty, their initial decision was to keep it up because, according to them, their First Amendment rights allowed for this kind of criticisms of public figures, but they were forced to revisit it when they realized that there are like deep emotional and sensitive cultural contexts in the Thai society that say like where defamation of Thai royalty is a huge deal. And the other way in which this kind of having region specific priorities hamper any global regulation is there are these priorities also leak into priorities regarding what sort of moderation decisions are to be undertaken. So you take the example of Myanmar, and the Rohingya crisis. There was a professed lack of resources that Facebook had to deal with that sort of crisis because that wasn't a priority up to them until the thing boiled over from bad to worse. And there has been similar kind of experiments and similar kind of tests when you look at India also, where Facebook has professed to have only filters in, say, English, Hindi, and Bengali, despite there being so many languages, so many diversities, as a result of which speech doesn't get regulated the way we want to. And there has been a lot of international collaboration and multi-stakeholder forums, and these have all been assumably in good faith, and they have all had their levels of success and they have had their pitfalls. But personally, I don't think that there can be any proper framework of regulating speech when it's top down, specifically because of this regional context. And any approach or any sort of solution that we should think of should basically consider a grassroots initiative as the fundamental unit of that framework, and then develop policies and recommendations and reforms around the said unit. And there are examples of how such kind of grassroots activism and such grassroots initiatives have worked in the past. So you take the example of the IPS officer Rema Rajeshwari in Telangana, or you take the example of Mir Muhammad Ali, who is an IS officer in Kerala, who have deployed local musicians and have generated and created content in local languages to educate and kind of organize people against fake news and against problematic content. So any framework, and India is part of a lot of global frameworks, the Christchurch Call and other frameworks. So what India can do in this juncture is recognize the importance of these kind of grassroots or this kind of basic initiatives, and emphasize on these to be taken into account, and emphasize learnings from these sort of initiatives to be incorporated in like bigger global frameworks for there to be any actual success in the way social media platforms are regulated. So I think that's where I am coming from.
Oh, that's super interesting. Maybe I'll go back to Karthik. Karthik, one of the things that we've realized is that when we think of India, and obviously, again, going back to the certain idea of exceptionalism, we think that we're a leader in multiple ways. But I'd be curious to, since you are in some ways the only IR person in here, to understand like how are we perceived, particularly in conversations of data governance and in terms of as a leader in this space, because we think we are, but would be good to understand from your perspective.
So I think most of these debates are still quite nascent, especially across the region here and globally. So we don't really have a great understanding of how these negotiations so far portray India. If you look at what's been happening in Southeast Asia with respect to RCEP, which had a chapter on data, and the Indian trade negotiators were quite insistent that the provisions there within RCEP that cover data should not be liberal, should not promote or should not have rules that hasten data flows, and should not in any way bind India's hand, the Indian state's hand in how it manages issues and some of the questions related to data. So even there, what we get is that Indian officials are looking at these issues more strategically, more transactionally, and not necessarily from I guess an exceptionalist point of view. And I think if you look at the broader literature on Indian IR and multilateralism, it's heavily burdened by this exceptionalist notions of India and how it should behave, and what are civilizational and various other sort of ideational and identity related factors bring, and how and for that reason there should be either a separate exception made for India within rules and other issues, or that India should lead in a particular way. And I think that's not the case, at least when it comes to data, and at least some of the other issues on technology that are featured in this issue. There's clearly a more strategic, there's a more rational approach to how and what the Indian officials are looking at these issues. And that's the sense that I get. And that's the sense that at least it comes out to me from the essays within the issue. And I don't know if Arunderjit wants to add anything more to what I just mentioned.
Thanks, Karthik. Just a very quick addition is that while there is it's difficult to narrow down what the perception is. There is definitely a desire among both large non-state actors that are involved in the data/norms formulation space, such as Microsoft, and among states and waiting for India to articulate a clear stance on some of these issues, both domestically and internationally. So at multiple times, India has been regarded as a digital decider, as a swing state, not only on data governance issues, which is the subject of this panel, but also on how we treat human rights. Do we respect human rights in cyberspace, or do we actually go for a more authoritarian approach that potentially mirrors what China and Russia and the SCO bloc are going for? So I do think that this binary is slightly flawed because there are various complexities that feed this binary. But the point I wanted to make was that there has been Brad Smith, for example, who is the vice president of Microsoft, has said multiple times that India, that the democracies and Microsoft are assuming that they are trying to champion cyber norms for the benefit of on the side of civil liberties, want India to take a stance on their side. And similarly, we've had in the past China making overtures and recognizing, for example, there was internet shutdowns have been supported by Chinese outlets and Chinese spokespersons. So both on data and on other issues, countries want India to take a stand, and therefore, whenever India does take a stand, it will lead to reactions from countries and non-state actors in this space alike. And of course, because of that, countries and non-state actors alike are trying to shape India's stance on some of these issues. So when data localization actually came about, there was a significant shift between the 2018 draft bill that was put forward by the Shri Krishna committee, where there was mandated mirroring of all personal data. And now it's been significantly diluted in the 2019 draft that was tabled by Ravi Shankar Prasad in December, right? And the reason, and partly the reason was definitely that there was Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who threatened that H-1B visas were on the line. Wilbur Ross, every time he came to Delhi, would bring up the issue of data localization. That's from the state angle. Then there were the people from the tech sector. Nick Clegg, who's the vice president of public policy at Facebook, said data localization is something that we should move against. Sundar Pichai said the same thing. So it's clear that both the tech sector and the state actors want India to take a stance, and they want India to take a stance in their favor. And the stance that India takes has to ultimately be in favor of Indian citizens, not in favor of big tech or in favor of the Indian state. It has to be, I think, as Divij succinctly put both in his comments today and his essay, that ultimately whatever stance you take, there can be data localization provisions that are good, that are benevolent, and they can only be benevolent if they are in favor of the Indian citizen and not in favor of this vague idea of sovereignty or the broader idea of state control. So yeah.
No, that's exactly what I wanted to also come to you with, which you mentioned this like sort of friction between community rights and sovereignty. And that's also something that the non-personal data committee report has talked about, is community rights. And I was wondering where in your imagination, what the interface between this is and how do we resolve this tussle, because it has to go one way or the other. And also because community rights right now, I mean, we've been looking at it quite a lot, is we don't know how to actualize this. While there's conversation, and I know you also wrote on data trust today, while there's conversation on creating mechanisms to actualize community rights, we don't know how that's going to happen. And once it does, how does it interface with, ideas of sovereignty?
Oh, that's a really difficult question. And I don't think I have a very clear answer. I do think that, see, there's two things. One is that, we need to, again, recognize that there are multiple sources of inequities, that the platform economy is not always fair. And of course, also that the, state power, assertions of state power are also not always fair, and create some kind of balance there, right? People who are advocating for the non-personal data draft will tell you that the state is the only alternative that we have to, govern a resource as data, or to govern community rights over data, or to kind of, allocate and take away power from, say, these major like multinational corporations and the platforms, that currently hold them. But and maybe also kind of, because I've been thinking about the question that was posed to me on the chat, that's not necessarily true. Like it's not that platforms are not inequitable, but also platforms are already built upon communities, right? And people have found ways to articulate their own like kind of desires, communities, ways of exchanging, both like for commercial reasons and for other reasons, through the internet and through emerging platforms as well. And we need to kind of maybe focus on that, right? We need to focus on what kind of, say alternative systems have already been thought of. I'll give the example of indie media, right? The 1999 coalition of like media activists and kind of citizen journalists, who use the internet, who use like the forum of the early World Wide Web, to challenge, to challenge like this neoliberal, aspirations and globalization trends, in the 99 Seattle conference around which the WTO had organized, right? So basically to say that, there are other forms of community building that already exist and have existed, and those are the kind of values maybe we need to talk about. And I think data trust, absolutely, and the kind of data stewardship structures that you've been working on are also really important. And also, and I think one reason that they're really important, and which the NPD draft maybe ignores, that these are bottom up, right? Bottom up data trust, and there's the paper that Sylvie Delacroix wrote about the importance of why data trusts need to be bottom up and not top down, is because we need to be looking at all of these different elements, right? And I think that's why the kind of fixation on just like raw data is very problematic, is because we no longer look at like, how data is created, or these various institutions that shape how data is made, the various technical aspects of how data and the platform economy has emerged. And maybe one like interesting alternative for data stewardship that way is, which I've also referred to in my essay, is the Decode project in Barcelona, right? Which is again a bottom-up kind of structure created to steward urban residents' rights over their infrastructure and over over like data control over there. So yeah, very confusing answer, I know, but I don't think that there are very ready answers for what alternatives exist, but I do think that the answer lies somewhere in the kind of spaces we've already tried to create over the internet, which we need to recognize and then move forward on.
Yeah. No, that's interesting. And Vidushi, even to you, like, I mean, you also talk about this sort of dissonance between, like we don't have an imagination of AI as a socio-technical system, like you said, and with its capacity to drive inequality, and I'm now quoting you, exclusion, surveillance, and an erosion of constitutional and human rights. And while we know that that's the case, how do we move the needle on that? And I know that you touch on ideas of, including civil society, including a broader negotiation. So are there structures that exist that can actually help build a more inclusive imagination around AI, and then over time, obviously, yield to thinking about India's position on this globally?
Yeah, I mean, again, many parts to this answer. I want to start just by thinking about, the imagination that we have of AI. I think often there's this tendency to talk about it like it's really special and we don't know how to regulate it. And even the people making AI systems don't know how they behave. And to that, I say, well, that's just not good enough. And it's also not true. I think one part of the puzzle that not we, but like that efforts at governance often forget is that first principles of constitutional law apply and can be really useful in governing AI. Like human rights law can be extremely effective in making sure that minimum requirements are taken care of. But we somehow like sidestep them, like Puttaswamy and all the safeguards written down under international law, and everything just seems to be forgotten the minute we're talking about emerging technologies because they're special and they're not. The jurisprudence that we have in context of free speech, for instance, is very rich, and it's more than adequate to help us solve most problems that come up with respect to AI. The second way I think that we need to start thinking of making AI more inclusive, or our approach to AI more inclusive, is to remember and also put into motion the understanding that context is key. So for instance, when we were studying predictive policing in New Delhi, Shivangi Narayan and I published a paper earlier this year that looks into predictive policing in Delhi. And what we found was that the idea of technology solving a social problem is decided by a few people in a room somewhere in central Delhi. They usually all talking the same language. They come from similar backgrounds. They come from similar training. People who would push back against certain assumptions aren't really invited into that room. So, for instance, one of the things that we found was that when you're putting together data sets of crime in Delhi, if someone calls from like a really posh area in Delhi and says, well, my purse was snatched, for instance, it's not like the crime is plotted to the posh area. It's actually plotted to the closest ghetto or the closest migrant settlement to that posh area, right? So that in itself is so problematic, not only because it's inaccurate, but it's also alienating in so many ways that are completely excluding people from, the idea of like not being seen by a system that they shouldn't be seen by. So I think having that kind of understanding of the human element of AI and the human assumptions that often become invisible once you have a system in play is really important. And just in general, I want to make a note to say that, when we talk about AI, it's easy to get stuck in one bucket or the other. So it's like AI is biased. It doesn't work as well for women as it does for men. It works better for white people than it does for people of color and things like that. But those are just the symptoms of the actual problem. I think to actually understand the problem, you have to first understand the context. And that's something that we don't do. I see a comment in the chat now that talks about how AI is a garage. For big economies, see India as a big garage. But the Niti Aayog report talks about India being a garage for emerging technologies, right? So that's not inclusive as well, because we're going to alienate a certain type of person, a certain type of community, a certain type of gender, whatever have you, to become the testing ground for it. And I skipped a little bit, but I hope that was kind of coherent.
No, that's super interesting. I'll take a question for Torsha from the attendees. This is by Bhumika, and she asks Torsha that what exactly do you mean when you say grassroots activism is needed in governance of data, and more importantly, how can it be done? Which is example of Decode, Decode's program in Barcelona, also an example that you're suggesting. I'm sure we all have lots of chiseled thoughts on this, but Torsha, for you.
Yeah, I think the why I emphasize on having grassroots sort of initiatives, I think this is useful as a context, is because we're like both governments and us as users and public, we're looking to social media platforms to solve problems that it's not necessarily qualified to solve, and also perhaps in some ways have contributed to creation of these problems, right? So when you're talking about initiatives, we're looking at ways of reforming. We're saying, oh, social media platforms should take down content within 48 hours, without recognizing that like even effective 48-hour or whatever sort of takedown framework would not solve the inherent design problems of social media platforms, which kind of capitalizes on attention and which capitalizes on maximum sort of inflammation for a maximum crowd, which is where the importance of grassroots initiatives come in. And what I mean essentially is kind of understanding the ways social media platforms actually impact people, right? Studying ways of why there are certain classes of people who are willing to believe and kind of forward things that they receive on internet, and then build our learnings and build our reforms based on these learnings and these experiences, which I believe a lot of high level initiatives and a lot of multi-stakeholder initiatives seem to miss out on, is why certain social media design choices and why certain social media factors uh, affect people the way it does. And I'm not super clear on the details of the Decode program, so I think Divij might be in a better position to answer this particular part of the question. So if Divij is...
Did you want to spend just a minute or so on that?
So the Decode project, I mean, it is a citizen built platform infrastructure. It doesn't have to do so much with problems of content moderation, because it's kind of like providing accurate information and participation, such as like giving ability to vote on specific kinds of civic programs to residents of Barcelona. But yeah, I mean, just to speak to kind of also to maybe add to just some literature to what Tosha already mentioned in terms of grassroots community governance of content moderation. There's a really interesting report in Data and Society which speaks to 3 modes of content moderation, one of which is like artisanal modes. And I think that's an interesting read to just look at the typology and the way in which content moderation has been managed, including through giving specific communities like within Reddit, for example, more control over how they develop their groups and spaces. That could be just one example.
I've obviously drunk my own Kool-Aid, and I believe that data stewardship can solve all problems. Also examples of data trust actually looking into content moderation are now beginning to come up, which might be an interesting thing to explore. Here's another question that comes from anonymous attendee, and I'll just throw it to the group based on who wants to answer. But will India relent to pressure coming from powerful lobbies like the US India Business Council and the US Chamber of Commerce, who are, I quote, categorically opposed to mandates that require the sharing of proprietary data, referring to the recently released NPT report? And will India mellow its stance just like it did with the localization policy? Karthik, do you have a sense? And then we'll maybe go to Vidushi on that.
Well, that's a difficult question to answer. I would just say that, I think it's important to not overemphasize the pressures that are coming in from the US in different forms, because then we tend to forget that we have our own domestic politics around this issue. And there are a number of different actors, including the state, different regulators, industries, firms, civil society. I can go on and forth, who also have different positions and ideas and preferences on these issues. Now, that being said, it depends what kind of a stick the United States uses, right? Because we have seen the Trump administration, at least, exhibit a desire to use the US market in exchange for policies that open up certain pathways for its own technology firms. And this is happening in several areas, I mean, including data with social media, with Section 230 of the Communications and Decency Act, with the US is keen to export around the world. So we need to take a look at the stick that the US is willing to wield to get others to comply. And the bigger the stick the United States wields, the pressures will tend to rise here as well. And I think, but that obviously has to be balanced by looking at what's happening domestically as well. So the trade-offs here are quite stark, and how those in power, those in charge of these kind of policies, how they differentiate between these two pressures and make policies will be important to watch, because the politics is contentious on both sides.
Vidushi, what do you think? Because there's been like in the NPD report, there's almost been like a, delinking of data from companies in a certain way. And I wondered like how that also impacts as we think about growing. And I think like, people have been calling it data nationalism. And I wonder what you think about that.
I think it's this is going to sound very cynical, but I think we have to keep in mind that when it has come to issues of technology and policy, it's not the countries that have influenced the Indian government stance as much as it's the stakeholders. So I tend to agree with Karthik in that, it's not that the US can effectively sway the Indian government one way or another, or the Chinese government can do it. It's what are they doing it with? So it's which private player, what is at stake, what is the business use case at stake at this current point, that can kind of like lend some sort of insight into how the Indian state will react. I think with localization, we saw that it was such a contentious issue, right? Domestically, it was a contentious issue, I think, along the front lines of stakeholders. But then the minute you started looking outside of India, it just became a business use case. And it said, like, this is not viable for us to achieve the economic prowess that we want to. So now we're going to have to backtrack. I think shifting that question a little bit to, like, what are the incentives to which the Indian state will react to is, I guess, a more direct way of asking which way we're headed in.
No, that makes sense. Absolutely. We have one more question, and I'll pose this to Torsha. Do you think that the confrontational approach taken by activists is working, wherein government bodies and businesses holding and managing data are attacked or trolled even for unintended mistakes? Considering so much evolution is happening in this space, I guess this is tangentially related to content regulation, but also I think more broadly to the relationship between civil society, businesses, and government?
I'm not completely sure if this question is directed directly at me, but I think I can still make a few points regarding civil society involvement. And I think there is another question related to intermediary liabilities, which I think will also nicely tie into this. And I'll just try to manage the intermediary liability side. And basically, when the draft interventions came out, I think it has been almost 2 years now, in December 2018, there was a lot of criticisms about, and rightly so, there were criticisms about censorship of free speech online and censorship of expression online. And the criticisms were manifest, and they was pretty vocal, and there were like webinars and events and like a lot of literature that was generated, and the drafts have since been, we haven't heard from we haven't heard anything regarding the finalization of the draft. And there has been a lot of chatter in the beehive that basically says that the government is actually considering a lot of the perspectives that civil societies put forth, including its concerns around the automated filtering of content. So I think only time will tell with relation to intermediary liability that how much the government has taken into account the concerns of civil society and also to some extent concerns put forth by private corporations.
No, interest. Yeah. Perfect. Thank you so much. I think those were all the questions, but of course I must misuse the position of the chair and ask one more as well. And I think this is just broadly to everybody, and I would love if all the panelists could, give short comments on this. But what's interesting in this conversation has been that we started with thinking about India's sort of global position on questions of data governance, but what we ended up with was the idea of bottom-up data governance, more inclusive involvement of civil society, a focus on domestic policy. All your essays mentioned as well the absence of a data protection bill and the ways in which the Indian tech sort of landscape at the moment was not ready. And I just wanted to get short comments from everybody, is that how do we tie in this idea of sorting our houses in sort of domestically, and then reaching to be a certain kind of decision maker in the way that we've been talking about globally. So because there seems to be a huge disconnect at the moment. Karthik, maybe to just start it off.
Yeah, I mean, I think that disconnect is not unique to India, and it's happening in a lot of different countries around the world as they try to figure out how to manage and regulate data, given its rising importance to both their own economies and geopolitics broadly. I usually come down to on most questions like this to institutions. How are institutions looking at these problems? What is their understanding of these problems? And are they willing to work with different groups beyond the state to get a sense of how to regulate and manage these problems? And I think the more open the institutions are, the easier it is for us to understand which way the trends or the arc will go in terms of data in India.
Divij, what do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, it is an incredibly contested space, even at the term, at the level of like shared understandings of various terms, including data, right? And I think that we really need to kind of, as states or as civil society, we need to get our game together and build alternative imaginations of what a good internet looks like. And I think that increasingly, like and I think like the Indian state has also recognized this, that these imaginations are being foreclosed by this very specific business model of platform capitalism or information capitalism, which is damaging and inequitable in many ways. And I think we need to kind of look at, what good can we salvage from platforms, what good can we salvage from information economy, either in its present form or, build different ways to do it. And these things can be radical as well. We can have very different imaginations of what the internet can look like, not just what the early internet, say like the World Wide Web, looked like, which was far more democratic in many ways. Of course, accessibility was obviously a major concern, but just in terms of things like the blogging culture and all, that itself was far more democratic and equitable than what we currently have. But even go back, to earlier forms of say networked governance structures or communication structures, which weren't built on like this like the DARPA kind of like internet that we have today. And I love giving this example of Project Cybersyn in Chile, which was a kind of like early AI system used to use data for socialist governance, which was a system set up by the Allende government in Chile in 1979. And that's a radically different kind of internet where the socialist state is in charge of a lot of information and is in charge of communication networks. And maybe that's also one way, one alternative internet that we can imagine, which could be more equitable. But yeah, fundamentally, I think like there are many contestations here, and we need to up our game on understanding these technical issues and their interface with, particularly with people and rights.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And Vidushi, in your mind, like, how do we sort of tie in the domestic with the global in a certain way?
I guess the first step, moving away from ad hoc policy development and ad hoc deployment would be a great first step, like a limited first step, but a first step in the right direction. Because I think especially when it comes to certain types of technology being regulated, there's no clarity as to what the government is actually thinking, right? Like, so between MeitY and Niti Aayog right now, there's like this very public spat on who gets to decide what India's AI vision looks like. And that kind of puts us on the back foot in global conversations, because people are like, oh, we saw this document, but there's also this document, and who do we talk to? And even at that very fundamental basic level, we seem to be faltering. So that would be one, just kind of have a more like cohesive approach. But also the second is to not just be opportunistic in terms of like deployments and in terms of coming out with a shiny policy paper that you need, but also asking why. So we can't constantly be, in this policy consultation process where we're talking about facial recognition, and we're talking about, another aspect of machine learning, but we're not really understanding what it means. I think those would be good ways to start.
Perfect. And Torsha, just also would love to get your perspective on this question as well.
Yeah, I think at the forefront, I agree with Vidushi that I think, especially with relation to regulation of speech, it has been super reactive, and it has always been like after something has happened and then you come up with a policy which is obviously not backed by a lot of evidence, and then it does not work the way it's intended to. And the other thing that I think, and this is also something that's not unique to India and has been seen in a lot of other governments, is where the government is basically delegating what should be appropriate speech to a private party, which the government should not do, especially because in democracies we have the power to hold the government accountable, but the same level of accountability is not extended to social media platforms, and social media platforms do not have any incentives to be held accountable by its people. So all of this, I think, boils down to the question of how much of a priority individual rights are. And I think what the government can do, even if it's building a collaborative sort of model for regulating social media, is to keep individual rights, that's rights of expression and rights of speech, at the forefront of any sort of framework that it's devising. So I think that's what my thoughts are.
No, that's perfect. That's all the time we have today. We're a little bit over time as well, but thank you so much, everybody. This has been a really enlightening conversation. I think like just a sort of articulation of where we are and where we need to be. And thank you so much for Arindrajit and Karthik for putting together such a wonderful issue and giving us the opportunity to have some of these discussions. And thank you so much for all the questions. Thanks, guys. That's mostly it.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Astha, and thanks all the panelists. So Ambar, who was supposed to chair this panel, is having some power issues, so I'll have to fill in for him, and that's a difficult job for two reasons. One, because Astha has done such a great job with the previous panel, so a very very hard act to follow, and also because it's very difficult filling Ambar's boots. What Ambar has kindly done is he sent me some notes which I will try and read out over the course of the discussion. I hope I'm still audible, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yes. Yeah. Thanks, Pranav. Yeah. Sorry, I think someone else froze. So anyway, so just to start off this panel on security from where the last panel left off, and this theme sort of kept on creeping up both through the questions and through the comments, and it's something that Vidushi said very explicitly, is that the problems are messy, and therefore the interests that shape India's response to these problems also necessarily have to be slightly messy. So there is a confluence of actors and interests that shape our stance, both on data governance and on security issues. It's not one country that's dictating terms to India. It's not one stakeholder, but it's really how India balances various interests, both at the domestic and at the global level. And therefore, it's a thought out balancing of these trade-offs that is going to shape India's policy going forward. Something that we've identified, and I've identified, is that India has been much more assertive on the so-called economic issues when it comes to data governance, the WTO, and cyber norms formulation at the United Nations, data governance, the WTO, and on issues like data localization, then on security issues such as cyber norms formulations at the United Nations, where it's been relatively more quiet. And Gunjan is, of course, going to speak at a slightly larger length on that issue. But really, I think, as I said before, it's difficult to segregate issues that are economic and security, because often they come together, and often security interests are shaped by economic interests, and economic measures are used to drive what are essentially security interests. And the most recent public example of that was the ban on Chinese apps, which was ostensibly on the grounds of security and privacy, but of course it came just after the Galwan Valley clash. So there was clearly an economic measure that was meant to restrict Chinese apps was taken under the guise of for the potentially for the purpose of furthering security interests. So there's definitely an interdependence between economics and security, which we have to bear in mind here in the tech space. On that note, let me read out something that Amber has shared with me. And then what he says is that the conclusion that I drew from this issue was the dire need for a well thought out and articulated position on several of these interests, which clearly locates India within the geopolitical chessboard of US oligarchy and big tech driven interests. And that's something that plays out with regard to the security domain as well, where we've seen polarization and fragmentation on cyber norms formulation at the United Nations. Where really are we, or what should our stances be when it comes to furthering our idea of cyber sovereignty in the security domain? And so the first person who is Gunjan, who's written a fantastic essay that looks at some of these international law questions and India's stance at these fora. Really, what do you make of India's ambiguous stances, and how do you see these stances shaping the global space? So Gunjan, over to you.
Thanks. Thanks a lot, Arindrajit. Thank you for having me here, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk a little bit more about this piece on the legal contours of India's sovereign cyberspace, and sovereign cyberspace in single quotation marks, for the reason that it is definitely a term that raises some eyebrows and also ruffles a lot of feathers. It's not a concept that everyone is on board with. And if I'm being completely frank, I don't think it's a concept that has yet been translated into reality. Nonetheless, without going into what is an extremely abstract concept and a discussion that might keep us here for hours, in keeping with the limited time that we have and the spirit of the discussion that CIS has organized today, what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to kind of link the points that I have already made in my paper to the discussion that we've had so far with the excellent panelists and the presentations that we just saw over the last 1 hour. And one interesting point that stood out to me is the focus on the concept of data sovereignty in the general data governance framework and policy space. And this was the interaction between the concepts of data sovereignty and cyber sovereignty is something that we at CCG delved briefly into our comments on the National Cybersecurity Strategy that we submitted to the National Security Council Secretariat earlier this year, where we had argued that irrespective of whether data is classified as a private good, as a public good, as a resource, or as an aspect of human dignity, if you're thinking of it as a semi-tangible object, data does reside in cyberspace. Now, what does this imply? This means that there is an intrinsic correlation between the construction of data sovereignty and cyber sovereignty. So one way or one route of getting to this proclaimed goal of data sovereignty is, of course, to construct the real the kind of infrastructure that you need to exert cyber sovereignty over the space that your sovereign nation occupies in that broader uh, ephemeral sort of space, which is kind of a mix of tangible and intangible elements. And I've discussed in my piece about how in Métis conception, we understand cyberspace to be an amalgamation of 4 factors. Now, there are international scholars who would argue that there are 7 layers of the internet, but Métis understands it as a combination of 4 layers. The first being the physical layer, where we're talking about hardware, components, fiber optic cables, and so on and so forth. There's the logical layer, where we're talking about protocols and softwares for transmission of data packets across uh, servers that are located throughout the globe. The third is the application or the content layer, which happens to be the most visible component of this broader realm. And incidentally, is also the one where in our particular context, the exertion of state control is manifest most obviously. And this stems from 2 reasons. The first, and being 2 reasons other than the fact that this is the most visible layer of the internet. The first being that as a sovereign nation, we have very limited control or ownership over the kind of physical infrastructure that makes up cyberspace. So we are, in a sense, inherently interlinked with a much broader ecosystem, which is very global in nature and is very much influenced not just by the actions and policies of other states, but as Divij very eloquently pointed out, the policy preferences of other stakeholders in the ecosystem, most of which are private players. The second being our limited control and limited understanding of the logical layer of the internet and the kind of technological tools that can be deployed to have the same or somewhat similar effects that are being sought to be achieved through the kind of control that we see in content moderation policies, or even in the case of banning Chinese apps, which is basically banning at the most in the most visible manifestation of this policy is banning a certain kind of content that was earlier accessible to our population. As far as control over the physical layer of the internet goes, I think data localization is a manifestation of that lack of control, where we're trying to bring in more cyber infrastructure and locate it within our territorial borders so that the sovereign rights of the state can still be exerted on this infrastructure. And as a logical corollary, control over, well, the behavior of your population and the various groups that comprise it at large. That being said, the multiplicity of stakeholders is what is also another factor that makes agreement on the kind of international norms that should govern this space very, very difficult. And when I say that cyber sovereignty is one model or one route to achieving data sovereignty, of course, that implies that that is one extreme end of how to achieve this goal, the legitimacy of which may not be agreeable to all. And that brings me to the point that Arindrajit, you had raised about how the binary between the East and the West, or the US and China, is kind of a false one. I'm not inclined to agree with that entirely, because I think it's useful to acknowledge that there is, in fact, a split that is centered around these 2 centers of gravity that are attracting like-minded nations. And in that divide, India has yet to articulate an explicit stance on what our preferred policy model is when it comes to regulating state behavior in cyberspace through international law. We've repeatedly put forth this proposition both at the GGE and the OEWG under the UN framework, that there are basic concepts and basic terms in international law, terms as basic as what is an armed attack, what does it mean to use force in cyberspace, are terms that countries do not necessarily agree on, and where we don't agree on conceptual definitional aspect of things, I think ensuring that sovereign nations are on the same page becomes a near impossibility if you don't agree on the conceptual contours of the object or the ecosystem that you're trying to regulate. Um, uh, which again I think brings me back to what our policies in the domestic sphere have been in this regard. Um, I have argued in my piece that while in the cyber domain, China has in fact been our traditional rival, but in terms of how our domestic administration or domestic control of cyberspace goes, a lot of our policies, a lot of our um, uh, incentives, a lot of sticks and carrots that the law may imply look very similar to the kind of tactics or techniques that the Chinese have employed in their domestic administration. And so I think as an academic, for me, it's an interesting endeavor. It may not be for all, to understand how in the understanding of our own self as to what is the self that is the sovereign here. Is it the individual? Is it the group or the community, or is it the state? I think um, there are some hints of an identity crisis in the establishment, where we do seek to exert the level of control that the countries who espouse the model of cyber sovereignty have taken, but at the same time we want to have a gloss or a very nice sheen or coating of human rights and fundamental freedoms over it. And whether or not that legal space is available within our domestic framework is something I think I would rather not get into, and instead talk about where I've finished my piece, where I've talked about where I've talked about the very real issue of countries having differential access to the means and ways of, well, what I've said is waging cyber war, but I think that the question of differential access applies across the board, not just in the sphere of cybersecurity, but also data governance and technological capacity at large. And when we're talking about means and ways of prosecuting this so-called cyber war, which people are increasingly scared of, we have to understand and again come back to basic definitional questions of what do we mean when we say cyber weapons? How are they different or similar to, say, offensive cyber capabilities? How do these concepts interact with dual use objects like intrusion software, which may be found in any hacker's personal computer and is not per se illegal to possess or use? And so how do you regulate these material objects if you don't have a proper conceptualization or a definition of what you're trying to govern? And in this endeavor, I think this brings me to the more recent work that we've been doing at CCG, uh, and this was quite an interesting find, where the government had in fact acknowledged the existence of software that is specially designed for use in military offensive cyber operations. But then again, as Karthik had pointed out, that uh, there is an there is an inherent inconsistency in domestic policy that we've been dealing with, and in consistently keeping that inconsistency in place, the reference to this particular phrase of offensive cyber capabilities, which is found in what would fall under export control regulations that are formulated by the Directorate General of Foreign Trade, was taken down from the DGFT website, and a more sanitized version of those particular softwares that they're seeking to govern was put in place. So we have put forth certain parameters, certain indicators in our recent work on offensive cyber capabilities to distinguish what these products are and how they need to be distinguished from other dual use items that need to be subject to a much lower degree of regulation. And an important aspect of that, and an important implication of creating these clear demarcations and clear definitions of what other kind of means and methods that the government can legitimately acquire and use, is, of course, the grossly understudied domain of defense acquisitions, which I'm proud to say is, again, one of the domains that CCG is now engaging with the government on. We recently, in fact, just earlier this week on Monday, submitted comments to the Ministry of Defense on the second draft of the defense acquisition procedure that was released towards the end of July, wherein we have argued and we have proposed that the ministry take on a more detailed study of what are the capabilities and what are the material means that are needed to bolster India's technological capacity and capability. And with that, I will yield the floor to my fellow panelists and open for questions and feedback.
Yeah, thanks, Gunjan. Very, very useful, very great article and very useful presentation. I think it linked some of the discussions on sovereignty that we were having in the first panel to the security domain, and there are obviously similarities and differences there. And of course, I mean, some of the work that you've been doing, a little bit of which is covered in the essay, but also generally which you referred to, I think going into the depths of things that aren't as visible in when we look at the geopolitics of technologies, but looking at what the government is putting out on defense acquisition, or your piece that looked at the SCOMET guidelines that to look at whether we have offensive cyber capabilities, all very important and are relevant when we think of the broader definitional questions. But coming to the definitional questions, I think one domain where this challenge has been there is, of course, the cyber norm space. But another domain where this challenge has also been there has been this entire debate on autonomous weapon systems that has been playing out in another group of governmental experts at the United Nations. It was actually led for some time by an Indian official, and Trisha's been doing work on autonomous weapon systems for some time, and she's written an excellent essay where she says that India is playing a long game on autonomous weapon systems, and I'll leave her to define what she means by this long game. But really, when we think about autonomous weapon systems, we're obviously thinking about us having some level of artificial intelligence technology to be able to bolster our stances at the UN level or at other multilateral fora. So do you think that has India been more active than it has been at other fora? Has it actually taken clear stances on the extent to which autonomous weapons should be used? And has Indian advocacy at multilateral fora been reflective of the domestic technological prowess or complexities that we presently have? So Trisha, over to you.
Thanks, Harinderjeet, and I'm glad you used the definitional confusion as the segue point, because that's what I was going to mention as well. And I'll start then by really talking about this issue with definitions at the UNGGE. There is no single definition, and the stakeholders in this autonomous weapons space, they fall along a pretty broad spectrum. On one end, you have, for instance, the Human Rights Watch's definition, which is just systems that are able to select and engage targets without meaningful human control. And this is a pretty broad definition. It can, by some interpretations, even cover automation and many functions that are already present in unmanned systems today. For instance, drones with pre-programmed flight paths and targets could to an extent fall under this definition. And the systems covered in this would include technologies as banal, say as voice recognition, natural language processing, computer vision, sensor fusion. And then on the other end of the spectrum, there's the UK Ministry of Defence's definition, which is that AWS are systems capable of understanding higher level intent and direction. And so AWS, per this definition, is fully autonomous in that they require no human oversight or control. So one end of the spectrum versus the other, there's quite a lot of difference there. Where does India fall along this? The closest we have to a comprehensive definition from India's side is from the UNGGE last year in March, where India put forward a document defining what it sees as autonomous weapon systems. And I'll point to two characteristics that there are 5 that it identifies, but 2 that are important to this discussion. One is that the systems would be capable of decision-making in that they can take decisions on their own as opposed opposed to pre-programmed actions. And the second being learning, in that autonomous weapon systems can determine a course of action even when they're encountering, say, an unfamiliar scenario. And so these characteristics really go into the UK Ministry of Defense's end of the spectrum, which covers higher level AI, deep learning, or highly developed narrow AI. And this narrow definition of autonomous weapon systems is by design and is in India's interests for reasons I will be getting into in the latter half of this presentation. So to point to what is ultimately India's stance on autonomous weapon systems, since 2014, which is when the informal meeting of experts started, there have been two defining characteristics. One is light touch regulation. So India's statements at the CCW caution against premature and unnecessary prohibitions that could stigmatize tech or jeopardize innovation. The second characteristic is an acknowledgement of global technology and R&D divides. It's no coincidence that a lot of the countries that are opposed to regulation are already ahead of the curve when it comes to develop a lot of technologies under this AWS bucket. US, China, UK, South Korea, they already have some form of the Human Rights Watch definition of autonomous weapon systems. So India's stance is that governance of autonomous weapon systems should not exacerbate existing technology gaps between countries. And this is pretty consistent with its stances on past, somewhat dual use tech regimes, including nuclear tech, where it has talked about non-discriminatory regimes. And this can also, this overlap between its stance on nuclear tech and on autonomous weapon systems could also be a product of the fact that the Indian delegation is represented by primarily the Disarmament and Security Affairs Department, by DISA. So it reflects the MEA DISA like school of thought on these issues. And in this area, it would be interesting to see if they change up Indian representation a bit, because we have a new division, the new Emerging and Strategic Technologies division, and it would be interesting to see how they would fit into this process. And so these two characteristics, light touch regulation and the global tech and R&D divides, these are a balancing act, as have been the case with many of the technologies we've talked about, between national security and then balanced regulation that enables economic growth, and then finally democratic accountability. So on military applications, at present, most of the work, at least at the Center for AI Research under DRDO, is focused on decision support or logistics and optimum resource allocation, coastal surveillance, so more logistical than lethal. Then in terms of economic applications, we've had all these documents, Niti Aayog's AI strategy, Digital India, the AI Task Forces report, all of which talk about the potential for fourth IR revolution to turn India into an X billion economy, and also its potential in expanding the citizens' access to government services. And going back then to the confusion on the definition, depending on how we define AWS, they may cover a broad range of technologies, many of which have economic value beyond their military applications. Then the final element, we've talked about military and economic applications, the final being democratic accountability. There is a lot of justified anxiety about the government's use of emerging technologies for policing and control over citizens. And this is something that will only get exacerbated over time as the government continues to push for digital technologies across sectors without the necessary legal protections for citizens being in place. And so while India, according to an Ipsos survey in 2019, records surprisingly the highest level of support for autonomous weapons systems at 50% of the surveyed group, those who oppose the deployment of these technologies, their primary concern is accountability. And so with its messaging at the UNGGE, the signal is that, look, we aren't just using unregulated tech for military applications and to suppress dissent, but to improve the lives and livelihoods of our citizens. And it's part of this broader messaging on responsible use that has both an international audience for normative reasons and a domestic audience. Yes, thank you. That's where I'll conclude my presentation.
Thanks, Trisha. Again, great presentation and great essay. And it's not just the essay, but you've written a number of other pieces on India's stance as a middle power, a rising power on autonomous weapon systems. Very important going forward. I found two things particularly interesting. I think there were parallels between your presentation and what Vidushi was saying about the governance of AI, where you clearly have a complex domestic policy ecosystem with multiple ministries or multiple government entities coming into the fore, and therefore that ultimately shaping India's AI vision and what you argued in the essay and spoke about also shaping India's vision with regard to autonomous weapon systems. But there are also obviously parallels with what Gunjan said before, not least definitional challenges, but also in terms of how we as a country advocate for ourselves and how different sort of, again, not, I mean, because the is an exception which has been there. Things that happen not so much in the public domain often shape how India finally advocate to come to that more towards the end of this panel. Let me come to Manoj next, and I think Manoj is of course an expert on 5G, but also an expert on China, and these two questions have become a huge public conversation in the recent past. Sorry, I realize I broke up for a little bit. My internet is less stable than I would like it to be, but so just on, so really the question for you, Manoj, then is that you wrote an excellent essay, and I think you wrote that essay in around April when, and then we of course sent it to the editors in May. If you were to write the essay now, after everything that's happened with China, to what extent would you change it, and to what extent are the things that you argued, like for example the challenges with our telecom sector, to what extent would you keep it the same? I just, that's the question that I keep on thinking, because your essay is one that is sort of being played out as we speak, almost on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, that's a tricky question, right? I mean, before I sort of begin to answer that, firstly, thank you so much for having me here. Thank you so much to you and Karthik for arranging everything and for inviting me to be part of the issue of seminar. This is a real pleasure, and it's been fun really listening to all these different viewpoints and different directions of conversations. On the issue of what I would do differently or how I would frame those issues differently, I think what's interesting is that the argument that I made in the essay was that, look, India's approach to a decision on 5G policy has been to go slow. Now, partly this is by design, partly it is structural. Our processes are problematic, which result in us going slow, but also because sometimes not taking a decision is the best decision that you can take given the situation that you find yourselves in. And I think that's where we've been in with regard to 5G. So in some ways, thanks to the conflict over the last 3 months, a decision clearly seems to be now in the works, because there is it's going to be very, very difficult for any government to walk back and say, okay, look, we are going to let Chinese telecom companies be a part of our 5G systems. So I think in that sense, that going slow may no longer be, it's still a formal go slow. We don't have a formal decision, but I think the decision in sort of effect has been made in some ways. It would be surprising. I mean, there's still, the fact that we've not made a formal decision still leaves some room for negotiation for Chinese companies. And I think it would only be the most optimistic people in Beijing who'd be thinking that there would be a decision that could support, their participation in India. So that would be how I would structure it. But I think some of the issues are still what this, whichever way we end up leaning in, formally or informally, it still leaves certain challenges for us, right? Because the argument that I'd made in the piece was that India's decision to go slow essentially is a product of four factors. The first is that, look, the state that the telecom sector is in, and that's not necessarily gotten better. In some ways, yes, marginally there have been improvements, but it's going to be challenging given the broader sort of impact of the pandemic on our economy, the sort of shrinking of capital. If there is greater money that's going to come in from the US or from the West or from other multinational corporations, just like Geo has gotten a lot of money, but there are other players in the market, and if they are going to get capital, because they're going to require huge amounts of capital to be able to make the kind of investments that you need to transition to 5G. That's the first thing sort of that we need to keep in mind. The state of our telecom sector isn't necessarily the healthiest. Even today, our sort of average revenue per user for each of the three major telecom companies that we have in India, and these are the ones that are dominating the market, Airtel, Vodafone, and Jio, the ARPU sort of ranges from 120 to 154, with Airtel being at about 154, and still hoping that they can get to 200 or 300, which is where they'll feel more comfortable. And that's not happening anytime soon, because for the market to then absorb, for consumers to then absorb these increased costs, particularly when you've gotten used to very low cost or at best free data, free sort of voice calls, those sorts of things, it's going to be really challenging for the market to absorb this. And I think that's going to be the other problem that we have for the sector to eventually turn around. Of course, the Supreme Court's decision last year in October didn't necessarily help Vodafone or Airtel. And I don't think, and that pressure still continues to remain with these two companies. Again, so that's a flaw in terms of how policy has ended up resulting in pressure on market entities in such a way that can be actually debilitating for them. So I think the state of our telecom sector is the first thing that we need to keep in mind, which makes it difficult. The government has been talking about sort of doing auctions for spectrum for 5G. Auctions were supposed to be held this year. There was talk about doing it earlier this year in April, then in August. I don't think any of these are happening. And I don't see them happening anytime soon, for more reasons than the pandemic. Fundamentally for the fact that who's really going to be bidding for this, who's going to buy this. Airtel earlier this year was very clearly saying that, look, we are not going to be bidding for this at the current prices that the government is offering. And that's the second point that I wanted to make, right? The way we approach spectrum allocation. I mean, in the past also, we've approached spectrum allocation predominantly as a revenue generating resource. We don't approach these resources from the point of view of network effects, overall economic value, and these sorts of things. Governments approach them from the point of view of revenue generation. And the 2G scan that happened in 2008 and thereafter, that sort of cemented that view so much more in public imagination. So today, if I was going to tell people that, okay, I'm going to price spectrum at a certain level because I'm taking into account overall economic value, I'm invariably going to find myself in a media scandal and a scam, which may not even be a scam. So I think that's the other sort of problem. Our approach to some of the resources is from the point of view of revenue generation. And that's where, so, TRAI has stuck to the base price of, 492 per megahertz, 492 per megahertz. And that's an issue, right? When the Cellular Operators Association of India is saying that, look, this rate is overpriced by at least 30 to 40%, compare it to international standards. When you're comparing it to, say, South Korea, the US, which are currently leaders in 5G along with China, you're going to continue to struggle. So who's going to be really buying this stuff? So I think that's a conceptual shift that needs to happen at a policymaker's level, which hasn't happened. And so we are going to see us, our telecom sector continue to struggle because of this. The third sort of big issue is, and this is what you were talking about with regard to China. I would sort of divide the issue with China specifically and the sort of geopolitics of technology, which even Gunjan spoke about briefly, into two different categories. One of these is a security issue. The other is a strategic issue. The security issue from China is very, very evident, right? I mean, it's your next door neighbor with whom you have this massive border problem. Beyond that, you have an issue with the way China is embedding itself within your neighborhood and your concerns about that. We've sort of spoken a lot about, democratic values and all of that, but also along with export of technologies, you also have an export of values in terms of how they are governed. And we've spoken about that across different domains. So there are all these issues that you have with China in terms of how it then impacts not only your national security, but also your value system, which can eventually have a play on your society. And I think that's the one thing. Particularly thinking of 5G, which is a transformational technology, it's a transformational leap in terms of communication technologies, the kind of effects that 5G has in terms of the kind of use cases that you will have, and the kind of leverage that you can then end up giving an adversary with whom you have a fundamental national security conflict. Do you want to give that leverage away? The benefit that you get for giving that leverage away is essentially a benefit of economics, right? China gives you high quality, cost-effective equipment. And you need that given the economic state that you find yourselves in. But at the end of the day, do you want to make that trade-off? Or at least even if you want to make it, how can you make that trade-off by keeping yourself as secure as possible? And around that, you've seen some of the discourse, not just in India, but even around the world. So whether it's the UK, whether it's France, the discourse over there has been, well, maybe we can define certain parameters that restricts the role the Chinese companies play, and that can address our security concerns. Also, maybe we can look at certain software solutions. Also, maybe we can actually have a distinction between the mythical core and edge distinction in technologies, and maybe that will help us keep the sort of security risks at bay as much as possible. The UK did that last year. It was a popular view in India also, that is one of the ways that we could go, and therefore going slow made sense to see how that actually plays out. Is that even feasible? In the last few months, you've seen the UK completely turn around from that decision. You've seen the French say that we are also going to be doing something very similar, although they've said it in a very different manner of speaking. They've articulated it very differently. Yet there is room there for Chinese companies to play, right? British telecom companies can purchase Chinese equipment till the end of the year, and they have to phase it out by 2027. So they're still going to be actors in there, and 2027 is a long way away. So we don't know how it will play out. In India, that was the model that we were pursuing broadly. It seemed like that was the model that we were pursuing, given that when we were announcing trials in January, BSNL partnered with the Chinese company, which to me was probably the most surprising of the partnerships that we saw that came out in January. So the security dynamic is one dynamic which then plays out in these ways. The final aspect is the strategic aspect, which is looking at the sort of technology friction and competition between the US and China. Are we sort of seeing some sort of, and to use a cliche, a silicon curtain falling around the world? You know, that you're going to see a technological divide between these two technology superpowers, and that sort of, that will lead you, and you will have to end up making a choice. In that sort of an environment, which we are experiencing, exaggerating right now, India's approach has been sort of relying on its traditional sort of foreign policy approach, which is like, whether you call it non-alignment, whether you call it multi-alignment, like we like to call it nowadays. Essentially, the idea is that, can we have the best of both worlds and carve out our own space, right? Doing that is going to get increasingly difficult. And therefore, at the end of the day, and in any of this, you can't really do that. It's going to be really, really tricky to do that. You're going to be plugged into one set of systems. And when you're plugged into one set of systems and you're purchasing equipment from certain kinds of vendors, there will be legacy issues. There will be liabilities to then uproot them and throw them out. It's not easy to do that. It's very unlike sort of, taking a decision on a value issue. And the costs of sort of having a company embedded in your systems and then uprooting them because you then have a problem is going to be extremely tricky. So I think at the end of the day, this has to be a strategic choice to be made. Also, given the fact that the US over the last year or so has been saying quite publicly that, there will be intelligence sharing costs. There will be defense equipment partnerships costs. There will be a range of costs for people who are not embedded with the Chinese set of systems. And just last week, when Mike Pompeo announces his clean network, the approach is that you want to impose those costs and you want to isolate the PRC. That environment sort of limits our space to maneuver. And the US, in Mike Pompeo's speech last week, he also used the Prague proposals as one sort of framework through which something like this can be done. So I think for India, therefore, the choice has been balancing between these sort of different factors. You've got economic interests and incentives given the structural problems that you have. You've got a clear and present security threat, which you would be foolhardy to underplay And the events of the last 3 months have shown us how foolhardy it would be to underplay that, however number of informal summits you may end up having. And finally, from a strategic point of view, what's happened over the last few months, 6-8 months with the pandemic and the tensions between the US and China worsening, is that you now know that this is here to stay. You know, if you thought that the January trade deal between the US and China meant some sort of detente and meant some sort of easing, that's not the case. This is here to stay, and it's here to actually worsen, particularly in the technology domain, because that's what this is largely about. So you will need to sort of maneuver far more tactfully. And I think that's where this business of going slow has helped. I don't know how long we can go slow. And I think the Chinese have helped us make a decision to not go slow anymore. And I think that's what I'd like to leave it. And I'm happy to take any more questions.
Thank you, Manoj, for that great, really well structured explanation of a fairly complex series of events that are actually going on right now. I think 2 points that kept on coming up both in your presentation and reflections of things that we've spoken about before are the sort of confluence between economic needs and security/strategic needs, and the need to look at them both independently and as related things. And the second thing that often I myself make the mistake of confusing is what is a core security need and what is a core, and how does that link up with, but how is it also different from our strategic needs? When you look at the 5G question, it can't be limited to our security situation with China, but it has to be a broader strategic question that not just panelists on this panel, but also people in the last panel spoke about, the need to forge strategy. The last, but by no means the least speakers for today, they wrote an excellent paper on export control regimes. That's something that, like some of the other things that Gunjan was mentioning that are often not given enough media coverage, particularly in India, is this issue of how we engage with export control regimes. Of course, there was interest when India became a member of the Wassenaar arrangement a couple of years back. But apart from that, export control regimes is not something that you hear about on a day-to-day basis. But export control regimes are very important, and they've been recognized by the UN as being important because they've been recognized as a tool that actually can potentially regulate dual-use surveillance technology. So what Samir and Arun have done in their fantastic paper is actually go into not just export control regimes today, but into history of export control regimes and how India has shaped these regimes and how they have done that, and how the historic shaping can potentially serve as lessons for the India dealing with cyber export control regimes today. Really great paper where I learned not only about the present, but also a lot about the past. Over to Samir and Arun, and you can sort of distribute time as you like on this to share your excellent essay.
Thanks, Arinjit. I will first hand over to Arun.
Thank you, Arinjit, and thank you and Karthik for this opportunity to be part of the discussion and part of the issue, the seminar issue. It was a pleasure working on the issue, and also reading all the other essays and listening to all the speakers today. As you rightly pointed out, we felt that bringing out the history of the export controls has how they have evolved, and also India's sort of interaction with the export control, the 4 export control regimes, is a helpful reflection to understand sort of a lot of what is happening today and our positions today. And it was reflected in the earlier session and also this session. So as Samir and I also discussed while writing the essay, was that we realize that as more things change, the more they remain the same. So having that in point, and given the fact that we are the last speakers, we are going to keep it very, very short and tight, and we can take some more of the points during discussion and Q&A. So the first point that I would like to start with is the fact that is it export control, or like Professor Dinshaw Mistry wrote somewhere, is it technological containment? So that is one point that I would like to highlight. And he beautifully describes this as that majority of the cases that technology halves were the developed countries, whereas the access to these technologies was denied to the developing countries. And another point I would like to also flag up is the point that geopolitical and geo-economic dynamics we cannot actually disregard when we are talking about export control. And this has been seen in the past also, because during the Cold War, how the export control regimes came to be shaped and came sort of were put in place was largely driven by the competition between the West and the Soviet blocs. And the fact that the West did not want these technologies to be sort of fall into the hands, so as to say, in the Soviet bloc countries, and given that they wanted to have this kind of a denial in place, these export control regimes sort of came into play. And we also know that India and the other non-aligned countries, like Manoj also spoke about, we had sort of vociferously campaigned for nuclear disarmament, whereas on the other hand, the Western states were largely focused on nuclear non-proliferation and also shaping a safeguard system. So that was what their priorities were. And another of their priorities was to restrict the spread of other military technologies. And for this, they focused on harmonizing the national export control laws, which Gunjan also briefly mentioned about the SCOMET laws, etc. Uh, so this started off with the COCOM, or the Coordinating Committee on Multilateral Export Controls, in 1950, with the Western Bloc starting this, and followed this up with the precursor to the NSG in the Ottawa Group in 1959. What is not very well known, and it is coming up with some of the declassified documents which have come out more recently, is that even, and this is very strange to note, that even the IAEA's information circular, as well as on the Nuclear Suppliers Group website, they mentioned the beginning of the NSG as 1975, and it is largely seen as a response to the Indian PNE, as we chose to call it at that time, or the peaceful nuclear explosion. Uh, that the Nuclear Suppliers Group came into play because of the Indian PNE, whereas the declassified documents are now brought out very, very clearly that it was a Ottawa Group which was the precursor to the Nuclear Suppliers Group. And the energy in its early days was called the London Club, and it still very much behaves like a club, because if you see, if you want any information about the energy, uh, they put out a half a pager or a one pager of a summary in any of their plenaries. Information is very hard to come by. Largely information is gleaned out of some interviews or talking to some of the diplomats or other officials who were sort of a part of the deliberation from various countries. But over time, what we have seen the energy is that excuse me, that they have managed to actually corner a large portion of the entire nuclear ecosystem. What I mean by the ecosystem is that they have managed to actually the fissile material as well as the supply of technology, both these aspects, the Nuclear Suppliers Group, the member countries, they have come on board. And this was something which the US realized very early on. And this is something that I would like to state, because we're seeing in many other domains in your discussion also, that in the US realized that for this group, the NSG or the export control regimes to be effective, it had to include the Western European, like the French and the Germans. And later on, after the Cold War, they also started expanding this to many other countries. But there was always this sort of hypocrisy or some kind of a realpolitik, if one would like to call it, that they chose to make France a member of the Nuclear Suppliers Group, even though it was not a member of the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty at that point in time. So that is one important thing, that when it is convenient to them, when it is convenient to the West or the US, they choose to sort of take disregard some of these sort of holy cows of rules which are now touted to us. And the US also realized that there was a very clear need to balance proliferation concerns, which was domestically also very important for the United States at that point in time, vis-a-vis the national and the commercial interest of these Western European countries like the Germans and the French, because they were largely seeking to export many of these technologies, like the enrichment reprocessing technologies, for commercial ends, for diplomatic ends, to as leverage. And they were doing this to many countries, and they were in sort of not ready to accept any kind of controls on export of these technologies. And this debate continues till date. George Bush, when he was the president, the Bush administration tried to push through sort of full scope safeguards, including enrichment and reprocessing technologies, and it was very, very vociferously resisted by many of these countries. So this delicate balance which was struck between the proliferation concerns, which was the US's focus, vis-a-vis the protection of these national and commercial interests of the European countries, continues till date in the NSG. So that is another point that is reflective of many of the debates that we have had today also. The third point that I would like to make, and I'll end here and give it over to Samir, is about the missile technology control regime. Again, some sort of towards the end of the Cold War, it came into play 1987, led by the United States, sounding 7 founding members, but most of it is well known and you can read it online. But what two important things that I would like to highlight here is that why is India's membership to the NSG? We got membership in June 2016. Why is it important for us? The one fact is that it is like almost full circle. The group has come a full circle because the energy came into play. One of the reasons, not the only reason, but one of the reasons was also our sort of satellite launch vehicle in 1980 when we tested the SLV-3. That was one of the drivers for the MTCR to come into the entire regime to come into sort of play. And the second and very interesting point was that even though China's membership to the group has been pending since 2004, India's membership to the group went through, which China didn't like one bit, and they made it very apparent that they didn't like it. And coming back to my point about why is it important, why is MTCR important, is I see it for two main reasons. One is that given our low cost advantage in the space launch sphere, that the ISRO has gotten so great at sort of launching low cost satellites, and we have done it for several countries. So access through the MTCR to this international space launch market of satellites into space will be a great advantage for us if the ISRO push for bringing in more private players and the private parties succeeds. And again, we are able to build up our capacities and capabilities. If both all these three things happen, we can actually tap into this very huge market. The second thing is also that uh, in the domain of avionics, diagnostics, testing, evaluation, etc., MTCRs opens the door for us for many access to many of these high-end technologies. How many of these will come through is another matter, but we have seen in the nuclear suppliers group that the US BIS has sort of, as time has gone by, and in the article, if you see, we've written, if you see from the NSSP onwards, the next steps in strategic partnership onwards between the India and the United States, we have got sort of most of the sort of technologies which have come to India need not go through a complete clearance. They are automatically granted clearance, and there is a very minuscule kind of technologies which need BIS or the Department of Commerce clearance today, as of today. So this can happen in the MTCR domain also as time goes by. I will stop here and I will hand it over to Samir.
Thanks, Arun. So thank you, Arindrajit and Karthik, for giving us this opportunity to contribute to this special issue of the seminar magazine. We really enjoyed in terms of our writing. In fact, this was Arun and I were like, this is our first co-author article on any of the subject. So Arun spoke about India's engagement with the NSG and the MTCR regime. I will speak briefly about the other two arrangements, the Wassenaar and the Australia group. Now, the Wassenaar obviously it seeks to limit the transfers of conventional arms and dual-use goods and technologies, while control of chemical and biological weapons is the domain in which the Australia group focuses on. I have three brief points. The first point is that we have to understand that these are regimes. So these are not basically treaties. These are informal associations of countries sharing a common interest. Therefore, they do not have the sanctity of the international treaty. So member states agree to harmonize and voluntarily implement national export controls in compliance with these regimes. So When India became the member of the Wassenaar Arrangement in December 2017, it first updated its export control as COMET list to harmonize with the international and the Wassenaar Arrangement standards. So essentially, these four groupings operate as sort of trade cartels by controlling the supply chain, the materials, technology, and the dual-use items in their respective domains. And that's, I think, the logical corollary of technological containment that Arun spoke about. My second point is that because these are informal associations, they operate on the basis of consensus. So consensus becomes a very critical principle for their operation. And that gives these regimes the much needed sanctity, authority to interact and cooperate. Now, in case of India, this consensus has had a great role to play in taking the memberships. In June 2016, when India became the member of the MTCR, 2017, the Wassenaar, and 2018, the Australia group, this consensus benefited us because China is not a member of any of these three regimes, the Wassenaar, the Australia group, or the MTCR, as Arun mentioned. So it was possible for these groupings to take a decision by consensus on India's candidature. Now, the same principle has worked against us in the case of the NSG membership because China is a member there. And therefore, this grouping has found it difficult to evolve consensus. My third point is basically that India's responsible non-proliferation record has contributed a great deal in securing the memberships of these regimes. In general, India has practiced a great degree of caution with respect to the chemical or biological or nuclear technologies, making sure that there are no leakages in storage as well as the supply chain. And that is a feature not just of the Indian behavior, not just vis-a-vis these regimes, but in general with regard to the other global treaties also, such as the NPT and the CTBT, where India has acted in the spirit of these treaties despite being not a member of it. What has India got out of these memberships? Arun has already spoken about the MTCR part. What I would just add here is that it has had a great deal of benefit in terms of India's defense modernization. In August 2018, just months after India got the membership of the Australia group, United States granted New Delhi the status of the Strategic Threat Authorization, the STO1 status, which enables our access to the high technology items in both civil, space, and the defense sectors. Now, if you look at the US rules, traditionally the US has given the status to only those countries who are the members of these four regimes. But in case of India, it has made an exception that India, despite not being a member of the NSG, India has got that particular status. So we are now eligible for getting access to many of the modern military equipment. And obviously, if you look at the history of the India-US defense trade in the last 10 years, we can see that that it has added a great deal to the Indian military's power projection capability. And my last point is basically about that. Whereas we have seen much success in controlling the export and of the conventional and the chemical and biological weapons, controlling the exports of the dual-use technologies is, I think, an emerging challenge for the Wassenaar Arrangement, the major agreement which governs this particular aspect. We have already heard about the Pegasus spyware controversy sold by the Israel-based company NSO Group. Now, Israel is not a member of the Wassenaar Arrangement, but has informally complied with the Wassenaar's control list, which also cover the dual-use software. However, if you look at the Israeli behavior, its approach to this control list has waxed and waned. The behavior is essentially guided by the commercial and trade interests, just as, for instance, the France and Germany's behavior in case of the NSG, rather than the interests of these regimes. And I think that is a great challenge in terms of, how do you ensure the compliance of these non-members to the control list. Last year, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Opinion and Expression, David Kai, had highlighted the role of tools such as the computer intelligence, mobile device hacking, network intrusion, and facial recognition softwares. The softwares which are used for surveillance, as well as have various other beneficial uses. So the report here has basically said that there should be an immediate moratorium on the sale, transfer, and use of these surveillance technologies until a human rights compliant regulatory framework is put in place. So ensuring accountability for the human rights issues in controlling this dual software is something which will remain a big challenge for these export control regimes. Now, Gunjan has spoken about how India's cybersecurity practices are, in a sense, matching very close to what China is doing. But I think if you look at some of the experiments that India has done in terms domestically, in terms of financial inclusion, in terms of making the technology accessible to every common Indian, I think India can be a rule shaper in some of these aspects at the global level. And therefore, I think that goes back to the 7 decades back when Prime Minister Nehru had spoken about that India taking a lead on the nuclear disarmament. I think 7 decades later, we now have a chance to again shape the rules in this emerging technology. Thank you.
Thank you, Samir, and thank you, Arun. I think, as I said, I learned a lot about both the history and the very present issues that are going on. I think the one key point that came across in both your presentations was that if, as a country, you behave responsibly and are seen to behave responsibly, there are strategic benefits in terms of memberships of clubs or other strategic benefits in terms of perception. So I think we have sort of already finished our time that was allotted, but I wanted to end with one question for all the panelists, and maybe quickly if you can answer this. This is sort of maybe it's difficult to answer, but given this entire idea of us trying to be perceived as a responsible stakeholder, a responsible nation, while still being cognizant of domestic interests, what would be, if you were to meet someone in the MEA in the near future, what would with your issue, a specific issue, or in general with regard to the broader questions at play, what would be your recommendations to that person? What should India do in this space? So maybe we can go in reverse order this time. So maybe quickly to Samir and Arun, and then we can go back with Manoj, Trisha, and Gunjan.
So I would say, I think the one good thing which the METI and some of the other ministries have done is actually engaging in the stakeholder discussions. So I would actually tell the MEA to have these kind of stakeholder discussions on some of these emerging issues at the global level. So, for instance, what should India do at the UN group of government experts? Convene a stakeholder discussion from the MEA of the people who are working in this field domestically, so that when the MEA gets a sense rather than being shaped by the departmental interests. I mean, Trisha spoke about the NEST and the DISA division approach. Rather than being guided by these departmental politics as well as the approaches, I think it will make sense for the MEA to engage in the stakeholder discussions, open it to the other participants in the ecosystem. The MEA does a lot of this, and the think tanks in this space do a lot of track 1.5. But actually, the government has to take that approach in its domestic decision making to say, convene a track 1.5 and then see what happens.
Yeah, great point, Samir. In fact, I didn't. This sounds like such a great thing to do, and I actually never thought of it. But in fact, Australia, when they were making their submissions to the OEWG, in fact, had a similar online consultation where individuals and organizations were able to submit. Perhaps there can be similar events convened that are led by the government. Great suggestion. Manoj, do you have a wish list for anyone in the government on what we can be doing with regard to both the strategic and security elements in this space?
I think the first thing that I would want the government to do is to start institutionalizing policy decisions and not make them arbitrarily. Unfortunately, we end up making very arbitrary decisions and then find reasons to support those decisions. So I think specifically on 5G, and this was something that we'd recommended about a year and a bit ago when I did my paper on Huawei. And what we'd argued was that, look, this is a strategic issue. Look at it strategically. Don't let your telecom ministry or your trade body push you in one direction or the other, the commerce ministry push you in one direction or the other. On 5G specifically, this is a decision that is a strategic issue. CCS should be taking this decision. But in taking that decision, one of the ways to actually make sure that you're not arbitrary is to actually create a set of standards or a whitelist that allows your service providers in your companies within India, your telecom companies in India, and foreign players a set of standards that they need to meet to be able to enter and participate in this market. Your country of origin is immaterial to that. Your standards need to go beyond that, and we need to have clearer standards, because otherwise you'll end up in a position where your market players don't really know whom they can partner with, when policy can shift, where do they pledge money, where do they not pledge money, and all of these are extremely cost heavy decisions that market players have to make. So government policy needs to be institutionalized, hopefully with a white list, particularly on foreign players and what they can do and what standards they need to meet to be able to participate in the Indian market. And I hope we can do more of that.
Yeah, thanks, Manoj. Arun, sorry, did you have any point that maybe in addition to your own issue that your wish list for the Indian government?
I always feel, and Samir and I felt this particularly because we were part of the government for some time, and we've always realized that the government, as somebody who's working inside, you've always had to sort of, it's like Alice in Wonderland. You're running to stay at the same place and you're responding to crises, and that's all you can do. And you are not actually, you don't have time to step back, look at the larger picture, get inputs from experts. And it's a very closeted kind of a mentality once you're within the government. And I don't blame the bureaucrats, because they have so much on their plate, so many things changing, so many inputs to take, and as Manoj and Samir mentioned, so many bureaucratic tough battles to fight. You have so many people speaking in different voices, and to sort of, it is important for us to have a whole of a government kind of a view. And that can also come in when you have some fresh air, some experts from academia, research institutions who are looking at this uh, sort of on a day-to-day basis, who give these kind of inputs. So what Samir suggested, I completely second that, because that is very important for governments, even if it should be done on a regular basis. But when you have these kind of policies, important policies or responses which one needs to make, it is important that the country, actually the government, puts together some sort of a meeting, these kind of a meetings, and getting experts. And I again would say it should not be Delhi centric. You have people across the country working on such issues. The government should not restrict it only to certain sort of only, because there are viewpoints across the country. And we have seen it in foreign policy. We've seen it, what West Bengal thinks of Bangladesh is very different from what Delhi thinks of India Bangladesh relations, and the same goes for many of these things. Technology hubs, Bangalore would have a very different take. Experts sitting in Bangalore would have a very different take on experts sitting in Delhi, because of their stakes, because of what their day-to-day interactions with the industry, etc., etc. So that is what I would like to just say. Thank you.
Thanks, Arun. So, Trisha, same question for you. India on autonomous weapon systems or otherwise, what would your wish list be?
I'm glad Arun brought up the Kafkaesque bureaucracy, because in the course of my discussions with folks, especially at the MEA across divisions, there is a sense of this is a machine that is rolling and we're trying to change it while it's moving, and it's just it's bewildering at times. And so this wish list question, it's actually the subject of a paper I'm writing with now my former colleague Akhil, which is a technology foreign policy for India. So there was a lot of excitement with the establishment of the NEST division as a nodal agency that will really coordinate India's stance on emerging technologies and integrate the foreign policy and economic policy and so on perspectives into it. And they seem to be on a good path. There's talk within NEST on really, instead of having the bureaucracy make these decisions, to have like a network of stakeholders that they will reach out to and consult on various issues. And so my hopes right now are pinned on that happening. Certainly the silos not just within ministries, but between ministries. It's going to be a challenge to break, but at least there's some executive level thinking happening on this, and that you have some moves, for instance, on having unified classes on emerging technologies for incoming IAS folks or IFS folks. And so there's some efforts to really break down the subject matter silos, at least within the MEA. And I hope that continues.
Thanks, Trisha. It does seem like some of what Arun and Samir mentioned, it seems like the nest from what you said is at least trying to think along the same line. So that's great to hear, and look forward to reading the paper when it does come out. So finally, last but by no means the least, Gunjan, she had authored a 225 page report on the NCSC strategy that I read and continue referring to very often. And I suppose that is of course a wish list, but maybe if you for the national cybersecurity strategy, but broadly speaking, are there 2 or 3 more important things that you would like the Indian government to do, either in the national cybersecurity strategy or otherwise, Gunjan?
Well, thanks for that question, Arindrajit. I think there have been some great substantive points to come from my co-panelists, so I'm not going to overemphasize the points on, including relevant stakeholders, getting expertise, and thinking before we put policy onto paper. I think my suggestion is far less significant in the grand scheme of things, but the one very humble request I have to ministries across the government, whether it's the MEA, the MOD, is to please proofread your documents before you put them up online. I'm sorry, maybe this is something that helps us end on a lighter vein, but our government's comments to the open-ended working group earlier this year, which have also now been removed from the OEWG website, in fact, had a hilarious typographical error where I'm assuming they meant to say tenets, but in fact the word was tenants of human rights, which seemed to imply that human rights are tenants to be evicted, which of course they are not. So I would strongly recommend the government to please proofread documents before we put them up. I know it's a small minor thing. I know bureaucrats have a lot on their plate and a lot to deal with, but we can't afford to make such errors in documents that go to international fora and documents that have significant legal consequences. As another example, the defense acquisition procedure draft that's come out just 2 weeks ago is missing an entire chapter on simplified capital expenditure procedure, which is just shocking to say the least. So I would like to see our bureaucrats please proofread documents before we put them out in the public domain. That's all from me.
Oh, important suggestion nonetheless. I think the non-personal data framework that we were discussing in the previous panel also has a very, I'm not sure if it has typos, but it's a very interesting citation style where they just put the link to the website, and some of those links, and the citation is also inconsistent and difficult to follow sometimes. So yeah, these things matter, right? Because Indian bureaucrats are busy, but so are other people at the OEWG, and for them to follow India's thinking, and clearly the thinking is evolving, the documents need to be better worded.
I mean,
so
I just meant to say that, the devil's in the details, and if you're aspiring to move from the status of a middle power to a great power, the documents coming out of our government should look like a great power has authored it.
Yeah, absolutely. Great point. Yeah, I mean, I think this last segment, these are all things that I actually never thought of, but this seems so obvious. So thanks to all the panelists for these great suggestions. And I hope that when we're already live streaming it, but when we do put up the recording, I do hope that people in the government do take note. On that note, let me hand over to Karthik to close this session, and maybe just think about what we can do in terms of making this wish list come true from the perspective of academia and civil society. It's been a real pleasure working with Karthik over the last, since January on this issue and on other pieces that we've done. And it's been a great learning experience for me. Karthik, over to you.
Well, first, let me thank you, Arindrajit and CIS, for conducting this really great roundtable today. And for collaborating these past few months. I think I certainly learned more from you than the other way around. It was also really great seeing everyone not just seeing what they've written, but connecting faces to their words and hearing them talk about the piece, of their pieces and the topics and all these issues, which will only become more important going ahead. I want to just end with talking about extending this issue into sustained work that connects the broad range of technology issues and discussions that we've spoken about to some of the debates and burning questions in two areas, Indian foreign policy and Indian strategic studies. So the first issue, is Indian foreign policy, which covers global governance, but also, other bilateral and regional issues. Now I believe that Indian foreign policy and its approach to global governance has become more strategic and rational than before. It's not generally burdened by issues like identity, culture, or institutional incapacity. Though I might have to revisit those views after the last panel, which the literature largely suggests, right? So I believe that globalization has somewhat produced a more transactional approach, which means that international rules and regimes and other issues, foreign policy issues, are looked at and considered as either opportunities to drive domestic economic changes or as impediments that undermine or hurt economic progress. Now, technology issues allows us to test these two propositions, clearly. There are clear implications from how India chooses to behave on technology issues, given the increasing importance to its national security and its economic development. So engage when it suits you and desist when it does not. Or is it driven by other considerations related to space and autonomy, which Manoj alluded to, or other institutional and political considerations? The exceptionalism argument, which came up in the first session, and ideas related to exceptionalism. My own hunch is that India will continue to behave rationally, instrumentally, conceding only when it is required, while ensuring these global rules are sufficiently broad and narrow enough to exit when possible. Now, one exciting aspect is that there's limited work on theorizing how India behaves with respect to these global rules, standards, and norms on some of these technology issues compared to other agreements and issues like climate, nuclear, so on and so forth. So there's a lot of scope to deepen the kind of work we can do here. The second issue is India's strategic studies, right? How will these technologies and how they are developed and managed, and India's positions on rules like the internet, cyberspace, drones, autonomous weapons affect India's strategic outlook, its ability to use force, deter adversaries, and influence the decision-making processes around these issues. Yeah, and when I mean strategic outlook, I'm not limiting myself geographically. It's global, it's regional, and it's also internal, because threats exist in all these different areas. And I think this will be an important area of inquiry going forward. There has to be more thinking on how digital issues affect national security and decision-making around national security. So rules that are seemingly rigid might not pass or meet India's objectives, while at the same time, there will be competing demands for India to push for rules that place limits on how your rivals use these technologies for strategic purposes. So how India manages this divide will be interesting to watch and analyze for all of us going ahead. And so I'm going to be working on some of these issues going forward, and I hope we can all do much more to create a literature that will be valuable for scholars and policy experts alike. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Karthik. And I hope that we can, all of us will, of course, be working on these issues and continue to produce work on these issues. And I hope that we can stay in touch and, maybe a collaboration like this, but even otherwise, just exchanging ideas. I think this session itself, I've already taken a number of pages of notes, and I've throughout both even though I've read all the essays, even then I learned a fair bit at this session. So I think it'll be very useful for us to stay in touch. So yeah, I think on that note, we can close this discussion and stop live streaming and stop the recording. And thanks everyone for joining. I know that some people dropped off as the call went on, but thanks for everyone who stayed till the end. And we hope that we can continue having these conversations. And again, thanks again to Pranav, who helped me set this up and worked with me to conceptualize this event and also set up all the logistics. And of course, Akash from the design team who worked with us on this. Pranav, can we close it for now?
Yeah, sounds good.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Sarandraji. Thanks, Karthik.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
thank you.
Thanks, Karthik. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.